Waiting to ask this man for this.
So I think he's sitting in here.
What do you want me to do?
Wherever. Sit where there's a seat, I think.
Good evening, everyone. It's 6:30. Everybody knows that I start on the minute. My name is Suzanne Wasserman. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History here at the CUNY Graduate Center. Please join us for our next forum on March 17th right here in the recital hall for a history of comedy in New York City. Please join us as we celebrate the history of comedy in New York City. Join us for a reading and discussion of stories by Robert Benchley, James Thurber, Dorothy Parker, Fran Lebowitz, and others. Tonight, without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful panelists. They are all contributors to Nancy Foner's new book, 1 out of 3, Immigrant New York in the 21st Century, which is also for sale out front, and I hope everybody will buy a copy, and our panelists will be happy to sign your book afterward. Okay. Nancy Foner, who's on the far left, on your right, is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the University of New York. She is the author or editor of 16 books, including From Ellis Island to JFK, New York's Two Great Waves of Immigration, in a New Land, A Comparative View of Immigration, and 1 out of 3, Immigrant New York in the 21st Century. She has received the Distinguished Career Award from the International Migration Section of the American Sociological Association and is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Pyong Min, which is on the, where's Pyong? He's on the other end there. He's a distinguished professor of sociology at Queens College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He also serves as director of the Research Center for Korean Community at Queens College. The areas of his specialization are immigration, ethnicity, immigrant businesses, immigrants, religious practices, and family gender, with a special focus on Korean and Asian Americans. He is the author of 5 books, the editor or co-editor of 10 books, and the author of more than 100 articles and book chapters. He received the Distinguished Career Award from the International Migration Section of the American Sociological Association in August 2012. A native of the Dominican Republic, Dr. Ramona Hernandez, who's third from the right, or left, my left, is at the City College of New York, CUNY, where she is director of the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute and professor of sociology. She is also in the sociology department here at CUNY at the Graduate Center. Her research interests include the mobility of workers from Latin America and the Caribbean and the socioeconomic conditions of Dominicans in the United States. Among her latest publications is La República Dominicana y la Prensa Extranjera, May 1961 to September 1963. Phil Kasinitz, who's sitting second from the end, is presidential professor of sociology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is the author of Caribbean New York, Black Immigrants and the Politics of Race, the editor of Metropolis, Center and Symbol of Our Time, co-editor of the Handbook on International Migration, co-editor of Becoming New Yorkers, Ethnographies of the New Second Generations, co-author Inheriting the City, The Children of Immigrants Come of Age, which received the 2010 Distinguished Publication Award from the American Sociological Association, and co-editor of the Urban Ethnography Reader. Kasinitz is a former president of the Eastern Sociological Society. Peter Lobo, who is sitting right here, is here in place of Joe Salvo. He has been with the Population Division of the New York City Department of City Planning since 1993, where he currently serves as Deputy Director. The Population Division serves as the city's in-house demographic consultant, applying its expertise to issues of concern to the city, including census enumeration methods and the development of population projections for infrastructure and capital planning. He's the lead author of the newest New Yorker series, and has published on the demographic effects of immigration, as well as on the methodological issues pertaining to the use of survey data. In 2009, he was a recipient of the Sloan Public Service Award from the Fund for the City of New York. And last but not least is Bernadette Ludwig. She is a doctoral candidate in the sociology program at the Graduate Center, CUNY. She is currently completing her dissertation titled America is Not the Heaven We Dream of, Race, Gender, and Refugee Status Among Liberians in Staten Island, New York. Bernadette Ludwig is also the co-founder and a board member of Culture Connect, Inc., an organization working with refugees and immigrants in Atlanta, Georgia. Starting in August 2014, she'll be an assistant professor of sociology at Wagner College in Staten Island. Congratulations. Great. Okay, so without further ado, Nancy, thank you very much.
Excellent. Oh, thank you.
And wait,
Wait,
Peter
what?
was going to come and fix the lighting.
Oh, okay. Lighting fix first? Okay. So what happens? It goes dark. Oh, wow.
You want to go back here?
No, that's good. That's fine. That's fine. Because everyone sees. Yes, that's the cover of the book. Oh, I meant to hold the book up, but I don't need to hold the book up if you're seeing that. Thank you very much, Suzanne, and of course, thanks for arranging this whole event, and delighted to have an event to celebrate the publication of 1 out of 3, Immigrant New York in the 21st Century, and to be joined by the wonderful authors in the book. We're here to celebrate the publication of the book, and also now we've been in New York. Those of you, I assume most of you are New Yorkers. New York used to talk in the sociological world about the new immigration to New York, but it's really not very new anymore. New York has been experiencing really massive inflows of immigration now for nearly half a century. And at this point, after nearly half a century, it's an important time to think about how New York has been changed by this continuous waves of immigration, and how the immigrants themselves have been changed by moving to New York. And those really are the themes of the book. The 1 out of 3, of course, refers to the proportion of immigrants in the population, which I took kind of poetic license because it's really 37%, but in fact, maybe it wasn't Peter Lobo who's a demographer, it was another demographer who said that maybe it wasn't okay to say 1 out of 3, but I said we weren't going to call it 37%, right? If we add on the children of immigrants, then the proportion is even higher. It's really more than 1 out of 2. It's about 55%. Now, what I thought I would do in the 10 minutes allocated to me is there are so many things that are new about immigration to New York now that we're in the second decade of the 21st century, which is hard to believe, right? So I want to just focus on 5 new developments to begin to give a flavor for how immigration has been changing New York. So one thing has to do with Mexicans. Okay, Mexicans are now in the top 3. What does that mean? They're the third biggest group of immigrants in New York City. They're a group of growing significance. If you look back, this is nearly triple the figure from 1990. They're now about nearly 200,000 Mexican immigrants in New York City. Oh, whoops, wrong picture. Okay, here's a picture from East Harlem, just one of the communities in New York where you have an increasing Mexican flavor. Even though Mexicans are now the number 3 group in New York City, they're only 6% of the immigrant population. And that has to do with the fact that New York is an incredibly diverse city when it comes to immigration, and no one group dominates the immigrant stream. So the top 3 groups, I'm sure Peter is going to go through this, are Dominicans, Chinese, and Mexicans, but they're only about 30% of the immigrant population. It's not like other cities in the United States where Mexicans are the overwhelming majority group. And of course, Mexicans are the overwhelming majority group in the United States, where they're 29% of the population. So although there are lots of Mexicans in New York, and they're grown in number and proportion of the population, they're still 6% of the total immigrant population. There are also new immigrant groups that have become substantial players on the immigrant scene. And we'll be hearing about one of them from Bernadette Ludwig when she talks about Liberians living on Staten Island. But there are other West Africans who have been coming to New York in the last 10, 20 years in large numbers from West Africa, for example, Ghanaians, Nigerians, Sierra Leoneans, to name just a few. There's been a continued growth of the Pakistani and Bangladeshi populations. And another change here is the real growth of the Asian population. 3% of the population of New York City in 1980 was Asian. It's now up to 14%. And just to give you an idea of how, immigration is really changing the racial ethnic composition of New York City. We are, of course, a majority minority city, 33% non-Hispanic white now. Hispanics are now up to 29% of the population. The non-Hispanic blacks are 23%, but actually that number has held fairly steady because there has been continual black immigration into the city. A large proportion of non-Hispanic blacks in New York City are immigrants or children of immigrants. New ethnic neighborhoods. There are new ethnic neighborhoods all over the city. There are also, it's interesting that some of the neighborhoods that are ethnic immigrant neighborhoods have become kind of old immigrant neighborhoods almost. Dominican Washington Heights, Chinatown in Lower Manhattan, the West Indian neighborhoods of Central Brooklyn. But there have been changes in recent years. For example, more Dominicans now live in the Bronx than who live in Manhattan. Queens of Brooklyn have supplanted Manhattan's Chinatown as the most popular destinations for Chinese immigrants. Brooklyn's Brighton Beach, and there is a chapter in the book on Russian Jews by Annalise Orlek. Brighton Beach is still an emotional and cultural home for Russian Jews, but they've spread to nearby neighborhoods, and a community of Central Asian Jews flourishes in Queens, in Forest Hills, and Rego Park. And Annalise talks about them in her chapter as living in Queensistan. And there are more and more polyethnic neighborhoods with groups from all over the world. Here's just a streetscape in Astoria, one of the communities in New York that has a big diversity of immigrants. There are also new dynamics to the ethnic division of labor. Now, by now, we're familiar with, or many of you are familiar with, the West Indian nanny or nursing aide. These are familiar in New York. So are South Asian taxi drivers. A recent report indicates that nearly a quarter of taxi drivers are now Bangladeshis, another 13% Pakistanis. A fifth of the black car and livery drivers in New York are Dominicans. But now there are Bangladeshis manning fruit and vegetable stands in practically every corner in Manhattan neighborhoods, at least they're on the corner in my neighborhood. Koreans, and we'll be hearing about Koreans from Pyong, still stand out for their high rates of self-employment. But retail stores are no longer the main specialty, partly owing to competition from big chain megastores, as he describes in his chapter. And nail salons and dry cleaners are now the two major Korean businesses. And here we go, most New Yorkers, right, have a Korean nail salon in their neighborhood. I think the figures, too, for all businesses are quite astounding in terms of the immigrant presence. Nearly half of all small business owners living in New York City are immigrants, and they make up 90% of the owners of dry cleaners and laundries, 84% of small grocery store owners, and 70% of beauty salon owners in the New York metro area. And that, among other things, is described in the chapter by David Kallick, which looks at an overview of how immigrants are fitting into New York's economy, but not just fitting into the economy, how they're also changing New York's economy. And finally, there's politics. And we've witnessed major changes. Of course, we have a new mayor, but among other things, we have major changes in the immigrant presence in New York City's politics. The city council has 51 members. In 1990, there were no members of the city council who were immigrants or second generation. By second generation, I mean born in the U.S. to immigrant parents. After the last election in now in 2014, 50 city council members are first or second generation immigrants. So that's really been a huge change. Now, of course, it's a change because many immigrants are now naturalized and can vote, and even more, there's a growing second generation, of course, born in the U.S., you're a U.S. citizen by birth and can vote. And I said there'll be more changes in the years ahead, clearly. In 2008, Yvette Clarke, the New York-born daughter of Jamaican immigrants, was elected to Congress. In 2012, Grace Meng, and here we go, okay, a second-generation Taiwanese American became New York City's first Asian American member of Congress. John Liu, born in Taiwan, but he came to the U.S. as a small child, was elected controller in 2009. Of course, he's no longer the city controller. He also did not do too well in his bid to become mayor of New York, but he is, I'm sure we're going to be hearing from him again. In fact, just the other day, he actually gave his support to Grace Meng in her second, her bid for the next bid to continue to be in Congress. And actually, some people have been talking about how he might challenge her, but he's not. But he's clearly looking for something to run for. And we'll be hearing from him, I'm sure, again. So just to sum up at this point, first of all, let me just say that this and much, much more can be found in the books, right? So you must read. There are chapters, 7 chapters on different immigrant groups in the volume. There's a chapter that Peter Lobo is the co-author on the demographics changes in New York. As I mentioned, there's a chapter on the economic changes that immigrants have wrought in New York and also how the economy has been impacting them. And Phil Kasinitz and his co-authors have a chapter on the second generation. So there's a lot of rich material in the book. Immigrants, I think, they're reinventing and changing New York. Immigrants have always done this. And New York, this is, the quintessential immigrant city, but they're doing it. There are new groups coming. New York is a different place, and it's a different place in the early 21st century, in good part because of this massive immigration. And we can expect more changes in the years ahead, because new immigrants are going to keep coming. And it's not a static situation. And as also a huge second generation, and soon a third generation, is going to come of age, and they'll be leaving their own mark on New York. And I guess then I'll have to edit another book, but I don't know if I'm going to edit another book. I think I might leave that for someone else. So for the moment, however, there'll be copies of the book for you to buy, and we will sign them at the end. So, but now let me pass the torch to my co-authors.
Good evening. Throughout its history...
Can't hear you.
Better? Okay. Throughout its history, New York City has reinvented itself demographically, which in turn has triggered social, economic, cultural, and political changes. Now, much of this demographic change is tied to immigration. And so understanding our immigrant population is key to understanding the changing social and economic fabric of the city. So what I want to do this evening is give you a socio-demographic profile of our top immigrant groups and show how immigrants have once again remade the city. Now, the seminal piece of legislation that actually changed the face of immigration to New York was the 65 Immigration and Nationality Amendments. And what the 65 law did was, for the first time, it placed all countries on an equal footing. Prior to that, there were quotas in place that favored Northern and Western Europe. But the 65 law, in the spirit of the civil rights movement, got rid of those quotas. In 1970, soon after the law was passed, the immigrant population in the city was just 1.4 million. Immigration had declined during the Great Depression and World War II, and immigrants in New York were aging and in decline. But thanks to the law, the 65 law, by 2010, the immigrant population had more than doubled to 3 million, and immigrants are now 37% of the city's population. Now, one big change in our immigrant population is the share of European immigrants. In 1970, European immigrants accounted for 64%. Nearly 2/3 of all immigrants in the city were of European origin. And 7 of the top 10 immigrant groups in 1970 were European. By 2010, Europeans were just 17% of all immigrants. And just one country, Russia, was in the top 10, and they actually came in at number 10. So a dramatic change, a huge increase in the immigrant population, and a change in the composition. So European immigrants about 17%, Russia at number 10. Latin Americans are 1/3 of the immigrant population. Our top immigrant group, Dominicans, close to 400,000, or about 13% of the population. Mexicans are number 3, with about 200,000, and Ecuadorians are the third group with 134,000, third Latino group from Latin America. Asians are a quarter of all groups, Chinese at number 2, and Indians at number 9. These are the 2 Asian groups in our top 10. The Chinese population is growing dramatically, and if current trends continue, the Chinese will be the largest immigrant group in the city in the next few years. The non-Hispanic Caribbean, very interesting group. They're only 5% of all immigrants in the nation, but they're 20% of immigrants to New York. They disproportionately come to the city, and there are 4 immigrant groups from the Caribbean that are in the top 10, the non-Hispanic Caribbean, I should say. Jamaica, Guyana, Haiti, and Trinidad and Tobago. And as we shall see, they're primarily middle-class groups in the city. Where do immigrants live? We've got 3 million immigrants in the city. About 1 million live in Queens and another 1 million in Brooklyn. So just 2 boroughs, Queens and Brooklyn, account for 2/3 of our immigrant population. And in terms of immigrant concentrations, they're heavily concentrated along the number 7 line. You know, Astoria, Sunnyside, Woodside, Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, Corona, and Flushing, Richmond Hill. In some census tracts in Corona and Elmhurst, but 75 to 80% of the population is foreign-born. And if you count the kids of immigrants, it's basically everyone. You know, so really heavy concentrations. People talk about, immigrants in Miami, and immigrants in Miami have pretty high concentrations, but Miami will fit in one corner of Queens, actually, the northwest corner. We have got huge immigrant populations, and this is relatively new, increased concentrations in Brooklyn, in Sunset Park, Bay Ridge, Bensonhurst, and in Brighton Beach. Now, historically, at least for the past half a century, we've had huge number of immigrants come in, and you had whites actually leaving. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, before the effect of the law, you had white-out migration, and a lot of white neighborhoods turned minority. And you had increased levels of segregation. Today, 2 things are different. One, you have a continued exodus of white. I shouldn't call it an exodus. You've got whites leaving, but they've been joined by native-born blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. And the second thing that's happening is you don't have the overall, the wholesale change in a neighborhood's population. You have integrated neighborhoods now that remain integrated, especially in Brooklyn and Queens. In this map, we show 2 kinds of integrated neighborhoods. 2 group neighborhoods. Basically, you've got whites and 1 minority group, primarily Asians. And we have melting pot integrated neighborhoods where you've got 3 groups, including whites, each with at least 10% of the population. And you have close to 700 tracts, about 700 neighborhoods in the city, if you use tracts as a proxy for neighborhoods, that are melting pot, and about 400 that are sort of 2 group integrated neighborhoods. So on this very crude measure, about 1/2 of all neighborhoods in the city have some level of integration. And if you look at the map of immigrants, side by side with the map of integrated neighborhoods as I've defined them, you notice that most of these integrated neighborhoods are actually immigrant neighborhoods. There's a high level of racial diversity in our immigrant neighborhoods. Now, I think it's important to mention that on many measures, blacks remain significantly, they have very high levels of segregation, from whites. And that is because a lot of our integrated neighborhoods are actually white, Hispanic, and Asian. and relatively fewer neighborhoods with all four groups. A bit about socioeconomic characteristics. One thing we look at, is the sex ratio. And what the sex ratio is, it tells you a lot, is basically the number of males per 100 females. Now, citywide, the sex ratio is 90, which means there are 90 males for 100 females. So, we are disproportionately female in the city. But you look at Mexicans, 144 males per 100 females. You look at Indians, 112. Ecuadorians, 112. So these groups, the pioneers are primarily men, and it's only later that women join them. But if you look at groups from the Caribbean, you look at Guyanese have 83, a sex ratio of 83. The same is true with Jamaicans and Trinidadians. For these groups, it's women who are in the vanguard of immigration, and they are later followed by men. The lowest sex ratio is actually that of Filipinos. It's just 52 for Filipinos. They come in as nurses, and they're primarily female. An interesting thing about the sex ratio, given that groups have lopsided sex ratios, it can have a big effect where intermarriage is concerned. How do groups fare in the city? Many groups with average socioeconomic characteristics, manage to have household incomes that are higher than that of the city. And Guyanese are a good example. Just 19% of them have finished college compared to a third for the city. But they have household income of $60,000 versus $48,000 for the city. And how do they do that? Many immigrant groups have very high labor force participation rates. You have a lot of people sort of in the workforce, and that increases your income. If you look at incomes of native-born blacks, look at their earnings, how much they make, in the workforce, native-born blacks actually make much more than immigrant blacks. But immigrant blacks have very high labor force participation. More of them are in the workforce, and hence they tend to have higher household income than that of native-born blacks. And the same thing is true for Hispanics. Overall, the native-born have household income of around $52,000 versus $44,000 for immigrants. So it's much lower. But if you look at poverty, the poverty rate for the native-born is 21%. It's 19%. Immigrants have lower poverty because their income is more equitably distributed. And finally, something about the future. If you look at the racial and Hispanic distribution of the city's population in 2010, as Nancy mentioned, about a third are white, Hispanics are around 29%, blacks are about 23%, and Asians 14%. Let's look at the population 65 and over. This is the only cohort where whites are a near majority. Now, this age cohort, the elderly, they represent the city's demographic past. Let's look at the city's demographic future, those under the age of 18. Whites around a quarter, Hispanics around a third, blacks at around a quarter, and Asians around 11%. And as whites exit the age distribution, as they pass from the scene, and as those under 18 enter adulthood, the overall population of the city will reflect this very, very diverse population. And the effects of immigration today will then be seen across all age groups. I think I'll stop now. Time for more. No, don't touch this. Just hit this. Okay. Yeah, you just hit this. This and this to go back.
And also to show the people when something is
Yeah,
in
you
there.
can use this mouse.
Use the mouse. Okay. Buenas noches. With that introduction of the Hispanic people that we saw from Mr. Lobo, here I come with the Dominicans now. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event, this wonderful panel. When I was asked to do this chapter, and this is a co-author chapter, I did it with, wrote it with Silvio Torres Ayand, a person of Dominican ancestry as well. We thought about why are we writing this chapter? And I can provide two answers to that. The first reason why we wanted to write the chapter was to provide a general overview of Dominicans in New York City from the standpoint view of the research conducted about the group. That's reason one. And reason two, we also wanted to problematize a little the perceptions about Dominicans prevailing in these studies. The idea for us was to encourage the reader, particularly the untrained one, to move away from mechanic and simple approaches when explaining the Dominican people who live in the city, a city that we know today is known to the Dominican people as far back as 1613. A view that has persistently remained about Dominicans across time is the transnational nature of the Dominican migrant. From the very early works, the very first book about Dominicans in New York City, published back in 1974, Hendricks, the Dominican diaspora from the Dominican Republic to New York City, to today, piece by Jesse Hoffman, A Tale of Two Cities, Santo Domingo and New York after 1950, the belief is that when it comes to identity, politics, culture, Dominicans are portrayed as the quintessential transnational migrant. Yet, there are challenges to these quasi-absolute, very tailored perceptions. In the few minutes I have left, I wanted to push this thought a little. In my research about Dominicans who migrated through the famous port of Ellis Island, I have found many interesting stories that had made me rethink some of the fundamental views portrayed in the literature about the Dominican people. A message I'm going to repeat we wanted to convey in this chapter. And let me share the story about a fellow who came through the famous port of Ellis Island. And when I was doing this, I was thinking about Professor Nancy, and I'm hoping that she likes this. This is a reflection of Dominicans who came through Ellis Island, and a little bit more than 5,000 of them came through that. I decided to focus on one particular story. Just a second. I don't see this well from here, but this is the fellow that I wanted to focus on. Is this man, Francisco Ulises Espaillat. This is the man who comes here through Ellis Island. And, the symbols here represent that he came married to this woman, and he divorces this woman and then marry Grace, who is an American woman. He's resting, by the way, in Washington. He was buried there in 1933, and his wife is now there as well. The symbol here, and I'm trying to use this mouse, I apologize for that, it's, he never became citizen of the US, though his wife was, wait a minute. His wife is an American. The children that Ulysses had with his previous wife, let's call her Dominican now, they are 4 children, if I see this well here. Oh, God. I apologize this here. He has 4 children. 3 of them were born in the Dominican Republic, and only one is born in the U.S., this fellow here. What is interesting is that he was born in the U.S., but he marries a Dominican woman, this woman, who never became citizen of the U.S. And that, of course, is going to give credence to the view that Dominicans are transnational. Of course, he went back and married a Dominican. And the 2 of them have, if you can follow this, 4 children, I think, or 3 children, aquí. One born in the U.S., the other born in the Dominican Republic, and this one born in the U.S. who marries another, well, is the computer. They told me not to touch the clicker, so I can't touch the clicker. I'm trying to do my best here with this. So he marries a Dominican, this American Dominican marries a Dominican woman, and the 2 of them then have 4 children. And I want you to notice how the 4 children here, here, now are all American. They were all born in the U.S. And I also want you to look at their names, how they change from Hispanic names to complete, well, they continue to be Hispanic name. One of them is going to marry, this one is going to marry into a child, and the 2 of them are going to have, now, this is the 6th generation, they're going to have these 2 daughters, and look at how the names of these 2 daughters change. The X on the Diaz is because we know that they don't use the Diaz anymore. And then the question that one asks is, are they transnational? When did they become something else? All the research that I'm doing, if you look at this pyramid, and Lobos spoke about the distinction and the disparity between the sexes, it is very clear that there are more Dominican women than men here. And if they wanted to do the kinds of things that they were doing before, Dominicans born here marrying Dominicans who were born in the Dominican Republic and who never became citizens of the U.S., well, I think it's going to be problematic if they want to marry, if a woman wants to marry a man. If they want to marry something else, it's different. But if a woman wanted to marry a Dominican woman born and raised here, wanted to marry a Dominican man born and raised here, there's going to be trouble because of this disparity that you see, particularly within the ages, the marrying ages. And because of that, if they wanted to marry a Dominican man, of course, they are scarce, and this is a Dominican man, and this is all the Dominican women. That is, they just gave me 10 minutes to do this. And the point of this is the complexity of a group, and I wanted to reflect that on looking at the transnational perception about the Dominican people. All of this, I am going to insist, it's found in this wonderful chapter and throughout the book, and I exhort you, and I ask you and beg you to buy the book. Muchas gracias.
Nancy, thank you for inviting me to talk about Korean community. I thought it's a much smaller group, but this is a big group, and it's my great honor to have a chance to talk about Korean community here. She told me to give a presentation for 10 to 12 minutes, so I thought I cannot have time to give a PowerPoint presentation. So I haven't prepared, but I don't deal with many numbers. I am going to give interesting stories, so no problem, yeah. I focus on major changes that occurred to Korean community, particularly in the 21st century. New York Korean community in New York, New Jersey area has about 250,000 population, and this is the third largest Asian group, next to Chinese and Indian community. And this is the second largest Korean community in the US, next to Los Angeles. Definitely, Korean or Indian, Filipino communities in New York are product of post-1965 immigrant. Before that, only visible Chinese community. But now, it's almost 50 years since Korean immigration started. So, huge change, and many second-generation adults have emerged to the community. They are in the labor market. Big changes. So I will talk about changes in terms of immigration pattern, settlement pattern, business pattern, and their assimilation, incorporation into larger society, and their community organization. We have so many, about 1,500 Korean ethnic organizations, and big change in terms of membership. Second generation moved in. In terms of immigration, 1970s and 80s, very active Korean immigration. But beginning around 1990, a big drop, and New York City experienced a big drop in immigration. But now, we have so many temporary residents. They are not permanent residents, including international students, employees of Korean firms, internees, trainees, visiting scholars, and simply visitors. And they outnumber non-citizen permanent residents. So right now, temporary residents are largest group. Next, naturalized citizen, then permanent resident. In terms of settlement pattern, 1970 and 80s, they were heavily concentrated in Queens, and particular enclave like Flushing, Woodside, but big change. It's natural, after 50 years, huge suburbanization movement, which started even 1990s. And right now, Nassau County, Long Island, and Bergen County have experienced a large increase in Korean population over the last 10 years. Between 2000 and 2010, about 60% increase. But Queens experienced only 14% increase. Flushing, no increase at all. And many people who settled in enclave, they remigrated. Huge suburbanization. And I think in 10 years, maybe Bergen County may have more Korean than Queens. It's very interesting. In terms of business pattern, as you know, Korean immigrant focus on small businesses, and definitely Greeks and Korean immigrants have the highest self-employment rate. But now, some change, reduction in self-employment rate as new immigrants who finished college here they have no problem in finding job in the mainstream economy. So they do very well. That's why slight decrease in the self-employment rate. And in terms of business pattern changed. Earlier, they focused on retail businesses such as greengrocery, fish retail, and retail of Asian imported manufactured goods. And these retail stores heavily concentrate in Black and Latino neighborhood. Now, big drop because of urban renovation. Many large stores moved to these neighborhoods. So Korean and other immigrants cannot compete with them. Now they switched to service businesses, particularly nail salon and dry cleaning shop. There are 4,000 Korean-owned nail salon and 3,000 Korean-owned dry cleaning shop in the New Jersey area. And they don't have to concentrate in minority neighborhood. They are more in white middle-class neighborhood or multiracial neighborhood. Even in Manhattan, there are 500 Korean-owned nail salons. This means not much conflict with minority other customers or business owners. Really, retail store had a lot of trouble with Black customers, but now, service businesses, they don't deal with the very low class or young customer. That's why not much business-related conflict, big change. Overall, occupationally, they are more assimilating. Many have a job in mainstream economy, particularly second generation. They are completely in the mainstream economy. That means more assimilation. So I think Korean community and resident overall, they are more incorporated, and they have more non-Korean friends now. But ironically, they have a stronger attachment to homeland because of a strong transnational activity. So really, they are living in two worlds. They are more in American society, but also they have strong ties with South Korea and active Korean cultural activity, a lot of festival. But earlier, when they had the festival, only Korean, but now, many other people are invited. So really, we enjoy two things. We put our legs in two countries and enjoy. Finally, I will talk about Korean ethnic organization. Koreans are heavily Protestant, and we have 500 Korean churches, Protestant churches, and about 30 Catholic churches, and 30 Buddhist temples. There are many other ethnic organizations. We have 170 Korean schools, weekend Korean school, and so many other cultural organizations. About 150 Korean social service organizations. Now, big change. Earlier, Korean business organizations, they were very powerful, influential. Because of business-related conflict, they controlled the community, they had the power. But now, there is no conflict, so business associations are not active. They don't have to be unified. So they play golf, and they have difficulty having meeting now. Earlier, they were tightly organized. Right now, Korean social service agencies emerged as a major Korean community organization. And right now, about 20 Korean social service agencies, they have annual gala to bring money. And, it's amazing. Usually more than 200 people attend. Now, second generation organization, Korean American Community Foundation, they bring 1,000 people at the gala, and 1 million. They pick up 1 million one night. And many second generation bring people from cooperation. While Korean immigrants donate a lot of money, second generation don't donate as much as immigrant, but they can use a connection from their company. They bring them. So we see, they are very powerful, with a few million budget, and they are very active. And right now, many second generation replace the immigrant as staff members, board members for these major social service organization. And the generational transition usually involve a lot of conflict, but in LA they had a lot of conflict. But in New York City, very smooth and great. Immigrant trained the second generation, and they are very successful. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm going to show you a different kind of PowerPoint presentation where you will just see pictures because you have seen lots of numbers, and I would like to know how many of you have ventured to Staten Island and actually gotten outside of the ferry terminal? Oh, that's actually a good number. Okay. I'm not sure how many have made it to Little Liberia, but I will take you there. But first, I would like to thank Nancy for inviting me to contribute to this chapter, and then also to thank Suzanne for presenting here. So I'm going to ask you to come with again, take the ferry, take a bus, and go to the North Shore. You saw in Peter Lopez, you saw that there was a small concentration of immigrants as well in Staten Island. And when most of the times people think about Staten Island, they may think about Italian American or Italian immigrants, but most of the time I've not heard people talking about Liberians, but you'll see them in the back on the wall, I guess. So when we think about Liberia, Liberia actually has a strong connection with the United States. It was founded by the American Colonization Society in 1820 as a place to repatriate freed African Americans who were basically enslaved. And I'm putting the repatriation on the quotation mark because the majority of people were not originally from Liberia, but is a way they could gain freedom, or sometimes they chose to go there. When the population went there, these American Liberians, how they have become known now, they basically took the same system that they left, the Southern plantation system, and implemented that in Liberia. What that means is they took the indigenous population, they didn't enslave them, but they also held them in lower regard. And until 1980, that's not that long ago, that's when the American Liberians ruled. And in 1980, an indigenous Liberian, Samuel Doe, came to power. However, when he came to power, things did not get better, but the country eventually descended in a civil war. And it was a civil war. Sometimes people split it into two, but I would say it was from 1989 till 2003, which ended when the first female president of an African country, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, was elected. However, these wars were really brutal, and if you think about a 14-year period of long-time war, a lot of people fled and a lot of people died. There was about 250,000 people are estimated to have died, and 500,000 Liberians were displaced during that time. That means they were either displaced internally in their country, or some of them fled to neighboring countries. Some of these people who fled to neighboring country, about 25,000 of them were resettled in the United States as refugees. The majority of them came to New York State, and within New York State, Staten Island had the largest percentage as primary destination. Some of you will probably wonder why Staten Island when we have heard like all the immigrants don't live there. That was part of the reason what I tried to investigate. So part of the reason was that refugees do not choose where they are where they settle, but organizations choose that. And on top of that, some Liberians were already living in that particular neighborhood, and the neighborhood had affordable, while not safe, housing, and that made it an opportunity for their family members to come to this community. When Liberians arrived here, they thought it was going to be heaven. Like we have heard that before, and I agree. Before I came here, I imagined the U.S. to look a little bit different too. But when the Liberians arrived, they basically arrived at JFK and they said, why is there a hole in the street? Why is there old things? Why are the trains not working? What's going on with that? And part of the reason is because some of their family members had sent them pictures they had taken of themselves posing in front of a building in Manhattan, where obviously the picture looked very, very different than how Park Hill looked like. Okay. Now, Staten Island is also a very different borough from the other boroughs. Staten Island is the only borough in New York City where you have still a majority non-Hispanic whites. And on top of that, it also votes, and you know that all, given that most of you are New Yorkers, vote conservatively. And that has an impact how people live and how their lives go there. When Liberians were resettled, they live in a neighborhood that's called Park Hill. Some of you may be familiar with that if you know something about rap music. The Wu-Tang Clan comes from there and has immortalized this neighborhood as the Killer Hill. And it is known as Killer Hill because a lot of crime and drug trades were happening there. So Liberians, some of them have noted that they left one war zone and traded in for a second war zone. However, over time, things have changed, and the Liberian refugees were also joined by Liberian immigrants, and some people have temporary protected status, which is like a refugee status that's limited, but has been limited for 20 years and has been renewed over and over, but nobody knows what's going to happen to that. So who else lives with Liberians? In that neighborhood. The majority of the population there are African Americans and African immigrants. However, over time, the Liberians have claimed that as their own. And you know that. When you basically walk in these streets, you can see, as you see in that picture, that's like a language, or I should say a literacy class. These classes and the organizations are meeting in the buildings. When you walk around, you see flyers for Liberian events. And one of the biggest things that you have seen there, and I think you saw it in one of the other pictures, is like the African market. And the African market, it's outside and definitely marks the neighborhood as something different from the rest of the population. Now, the market also is something that where younger generation and older generation Liberians can find something they agree upon. That market represents for them home away from home, and a lot of younger Liberians see that too. But however, and this is what I actually concentrate most in the chapters, that some of the there are huge generational issues that the kids and their parents, and when I say parents, it could also mean grandparents or aunts, somebody who's raising them, don't always agree with the same thing. So for the kids, it's basically they want to be American, they want to learn American rules, whereas the immigrant parents' household very often want to hold on to Liberian traditions. But for Liberian youth, what it means to be Liberian is very different than from the parents. For Liberian youth, they are confronted with lots of stereotypes that we see in the media, or they are taunted in school, or even some of their teachers have that. They are being asked if they have tails, if they live in the trees, if they live naked. And then if we think about the images in the media, it's most of the time of starving children, wars, and wild animals running around. And on top of that, there's also a stigma of refugee. It was a different kind of refugee when you're Cuban and you're saying you're fighting communism than when you are also happen to be a black refugee. A lot of times people again, merge that with these images of being somebody coming from a very poor country. In addition to that, they also don't take a lot of pride in being Liberian because a lot of their parents have low status jobs. A lot of them work as home health aides or security guards. Part of that is because some of the women, or a lot of the women, don't know how to read and write. And so these were the only jobs that were available for them. However, parents on the other side are very proud to be Liberian because they can also distinguish between Liberia before the war. So when I spoke with them, and I spent the last 4 or 5 years almost there, they would always say there is a there's a pre-war Liberia, and this is what they would be identifying with, and they're taking total pride in Liberian heritage. And they have also felt that there's some advantage in the job market of being being a foreign-born black resident. And I think they are taking pride in their Liberian heritage because they can remember what it is. But the children are just being told, you're Liberian. They don't know anything about them. A lot of the younger generation I asked, they were actually born in refugee camps. They don't know what it means. Also, the war affected the population, both the younger generation and the older generation. So while the younger generation may not remember the traumas and the horrific crimes that happened during the war, their parents definitely do. And a lot of the parents did not have adequate counseling or did not seek any counseling at all. So they're dealing with extended trauma. Also, the parents have to send remittances home because the country is still in transition. On top of that, the parents don't have time for the kids because a lot of the parents work in 2-3 jobs and they're working as home health aides. Many of them are live-in, so meaning that they live with somebody else and the kids are left to their own devices. Something that also happened already during the war and it continued is a role reversal, meaning that the children know more than the parents do. And that's usually, and now I can say that as an adult, but it's usually not so good if the kids know more, meaning that the kids tell the parents what the story is. So if the parents don't know how to read and write, obviously the child is going to tell you something very different than what's written on the letter. They're going to say, no, E means like excellent. Or, they will come up with all kind of different explanation, whatever their grade stands for. So basically the children then also learn quicker the American rules. And one of the first things and I've worked with many refugees and immigrants have learned, is that what it means to call 911. And so the children tell their parents, if you beat me, the Liberian way of parenting a lot of times is to spank them. They say I will call 911 and then I will get taken, or you will be put in jail. The parents are really worried about that because they don't know that in the United States or in New York, you can actually allow to spank a child. You can just not leave a bruise. I'm not endorsing that, I'm just stating the facts. So again, the children are calling 911 and the parents don't know what to do. They live in a neighborhood there's still violence happening. Just before Christmas, there was a shooting, people died, drug trafficking is happening. So the parents are really concerned about that. And in addition to that, there's also stereotypes about neglect and uncaring African parents in the schools. And that contributes to that. So the children and the parents are having some clashes. But before my time is up, I want to end on a positive note that certain things are changing. So the Liberian kids to whom often Liberia just means something negative with the war and any other kinds of, or in crime, the war, and I would say also these other negative images, they are trying to learn from their parents what else it means to be Liberian. So some of the organizations are teaching the younger generation dance, they're teaching them also how to cook Liberian food and things of that nature. Also, parents have been, with the help of different organizations, have been adopting new parenting styles, meaning that they leave maybe their paddle or their switch or whatever it is to the side and start talking to the kids instead of using the different kind of measurements. Also, many of the youth were really successful in education. When I met with a lot of the Liberian immigrants, and I met with them in their homes, before we would start talking about it, they would either show me their children's certificates, like how they graduated from high school, or they had it displayed on the wall. That basically shows that the children are succeeding against all these odds, and the schools are not that great, I should also say that. And having said that, and so there's hope that they eventually will overcome the traumas that they had and then embrace a life that both Liberian parents and Liberian youth can enjoy together. Thank you.
Well, I don't have any pictures, and I'm glad actually, because nothing that I took could follow those. So, I'd like to thank Nancy for... we're turning the lights off. Even better. I want to thank Nancy for inviting me to contribute to this wonderful volume, and of course Suzanne for arranging the occasion. And the chapter that my co-authors John Mollenkoff and Mary Waters and I wrote, the chapter was about the second generation, or perhaps more accurately what we'd call the second and 1.5 generation. That is, youth who were born abroad but came here as children and were raised largely in the United States, or folks who were born here of immigrant parents. And first of all, I think that's very wise of Nancy to, although many of the chapters in the book are about specific groups, and they're very specific stories, as you've just heard, and they really get into the fascinating details of each of these communities, she very wisely also had some general chapters that are about the larger picture of what's happening to New York in the economy, in politics, in demography, as you heard earlier, and in this case, something kind of a look into the future, what is happening to the children of immigrants. And while immigrants may be a little more than 1 out of 3, we have to get the demography right, the second generation among young adults is definitely more than 1 out of 3. In fact, among young adults 18 to 30, roughly, people who are the children of immigrants actually outnumber both immigrants and the children of natives. They're the modal category at this point, and in many ways they're defining the social situations in which people find themselves. Among people under the age of 18, they're the large majority, almost 2/3. Now, that, of course, doesn't necessarily foretell the future in any direct sense, since a lot more adult immigrants will come at some later point. But it really does tell you a little bit about what the future looks like. And I was thinking back as I was seeing Peter Lobo's charts about the age distribution. And one of the fascinating things here is the degree to which ethnicity and age interact. And so if you were a New Yorker of a certain age and a white hair color like myself, you most likely live in a world where there still are a lot of whites and a lot of African Americans and a lot of Puerto Ricans. Okay? And the world in which we socialize, the world in which our coworkers, the people we consider our peers, very often fall into those groups. The demography looks really, really different if you were someone who's my kids' age as teenagers, or even someone in your 20s and 30s. The people with whom you socialize, with whom you date, with whom you compete for jobs, with whom you sit in classrooms, are a far, far more diverse group. Okay? And to some extent, that changes, I think, the cultural life of the city and the social life of the city, even for the children of natives. Okay? Because that diversity is just a fact of life that young New Yorkers increasingly are just accepting. The future looks really different from the past. Now, very quickly, what does that mean? Well, my colleagues and I engaged in a fairly long study of the children of immigrants using a lot of different methods. I won't bore you with all the details. But we were essentially looking at 5 groups, Chinese, West Indians, Dominicans, Russian Jews, and South Americans, so they're sort of corporate groups, and also 3 native groups, native whites of native parentage. Interestingly, kind of hard to find in New York. You've got to really go find people who are, 3rd generation plus, native African Americans of native parentage, and long-term New York-born Puerto Ricans. So 8 groups in all to look at. And we wanted to sort of assess what their situation in New York was like as they entered adulthood. We were really particularly interested in young adults. You can only learn so much from children in terms of where they're going to end up. In fact, if anything, we probably were looking at people who were a little bit too young to get the full story of where they were going to end up in terms of their life trajectories, but we got them at a point where you could actually start to get some adult experiences as people were at least finishing their primary education. And I guess the overall story, it's hard to summarize all the various stories you tell in a situation like this, but the overall story was really one of modest but measurable upward mobility, particularly in terms of education. To put it crudely, almost every group is getting better education than their immigrant parents. Now, that's not too surprising. In some cases, the immigrant parents start with very, very low rates. But there really are measurable differences for almost every group vis-a-vis their parents. Almost every group is doing better in terms of both education and a lot better in terms of labor force participation than the native group that most closely corresponds to them racially. And that's a complicated thing, so I'll try to unpack it for a moment. Well, to be crude about it, the second-generation Latinos tended to be doing better than their age peer long-term New York Puerto Ricans. You know, the children of black immigrants were doing better than the children of black natives of the same age in terms of both education and labor force participation. The children of white immigrants were doing better than the children of white natives, and the children of Chinese immigrants were doing better than everybody. Now, the differences in some cases are quite modest and shouldn't perhaps be overstated. Race still mattered a lot. Okay. And race still mattered both not only in terms of people's educational experience, mattered in terms of the kind of jobs people had, it mattered in terms of people's perceptions in daily life. One of the things that we found out with our in-depth interviews was race seemed to be really important in people's minds in terms of things like relations in public. You know, the children of black immigrants and the children of Latino immigrants were getting stopped and frisked in the street very much the same way the children of native Latinos and African Americans were. And their thoughts about that and what that meant in terms of race and becoming part of a racial minority and the way in which public encounters in the street were often part of that were very similar in some ways to those of native African Americans and native Latinos. Nevertheless, in other ways, their experience was quite different. And in fact, there's a cute statistic that comes out of England, which is called the NEET rate, which is not in education, employment, or training. Okay, and the reason you want this statistic is that there's a lot of fudge in terms of what is or is not labor force participation. But if you ask somebody, are you in any training program at all? You know, you can usually get an answer, yes or no. Are you in education, part-time, full-time, whatever? We'll get it down. Do you have a job? Right? So the group that says no to all of those questions, okay, is clearly the group that is having the hardest time fitting into American society. And when you look at it that way, it really is quite striking that literally all of the immigrant groups we looked at were doing considerably better than native minorities. The Russians and the Chinese were doing better than native whites. Okay. The other groups were somewhere between native minorities, native African Americans and Puerto Ricans and native whites. And I think that that probably kind of is a good analysis, a good summary of where people sit. Now, when I said modest upward mobility, I should point out there's some obvious exceptions. The Russian Jews were doing quite well by any measure, but not really that upwardly mobile in educational sense because their parents were extremely well educated. And to some extent, that's also sort of the situation with Koreans, who we didn't study, but one of a graduate student that both Pyong Min and I mentored many years ago, Daeyoung Kim, actually did a parallel study with a slightly different sampling method of Koreans, and he found something quite similar, that there was considerable upward mobility, but their parents actually were reasonably well educated to start with. Okay. The Chinese were a much more interesting case in the sense that that group was having quite dramatic educational success, despite the fact that on average their parents didn't have those great educational backgrounds. They weren't highly selected for education, and while there was obviously a difference, the children of Chinese doctors do better than the children of Chinese waiters and garment workers, but the children of Chinese waiters and garment workers do pretty damn well. And that was kind of an interesting Well, one of the things that makes that particularly interesting, this is what I was trying to say, is that very often that happens with success in institutions that we normally don't think of as that successful. The Chinese were the group that was the most likely to actually be in the New York City public schools. Okay? So even in a very, very problematic school system, okay, people are sometimes able to find islands of excellence, and it's a very interesting story. I don't have to time to go into right now of exactly how that tends to work. Now, there are also, as Nancy mentioned before, beginning to be a very interesting emergence of second-generation children of immigrants active in New York City politics. And the recent city council election shows that very well. And again, the careers of people like Grace Meng, Yvette Clark, and John Liu, I think does point to a kind of some things about the future. And in some ways defies stereotypes. For a long time, people would say, well, the Chinese are very interested in business and work, but don't do politics. And we almost started, and people were always telling us don't do politics. Well, in the last few years, you know, the children of we've had a child of a Chinese immigrant as a citywide elected controller, and the child of a Chinese immigrant elected to Congress. So the notion that the Chinese don't do politics is one of those things that I think is going to have to be rethought. I guess the other mention I should just say in terms of the overall culture of the city, I think it's important to remember, and this is something that really emerged in Bernadette Ludwig's presentation just a moment ago, is the whole question of generational change and where people think they fit and who they think they are. We asked people a lot of how they think of themselves as American or not. And which is, of course, one of the questions that people charged us with, the folks who paid for this study really charged us with, because they were curious. Are people fitting in? How are they doing? Will they be upwardly mobile the way we imagined that immigrants in the past were? These were the kind of things that framed the whole question that I think people are concerned about immigration. So one of the things we were getting to people was, well, do you feel like you're part of America? And very often the answer came down to, well, who's asking? Compared to my parents, yes, I'm an American. They're a bunch of foreigners. Compared to those people I see on television, you know, they have sort of this myth of a very blonde America that lives on the other side of the Hudson. Well, no, I'm not. Those are Americans. They really had a hard time expressing it, but the thing that came out most often is people say, well, I'm a New Yorker. You know? And that became, I think, kind of a running theme, that the notion of a kind of an urban youth culture that they felt very much a part of, that was very, very diverse, very multiracial, and in which having foreign parents wasn't unusual, and wasn't something that they should worry about, that wasn't something that caused any dramatic trauma. Now, there is a lot of tension with parents, as you can well imagine. Every teenager in the history of the planet, mostly including my own, has at one point or another said to their parents, Dad, you know nothing about my world. You don't understand the way things are today. You just don't get the situation that I'm in. Your advice is worthless. Some of you have heard this too. The interesting thing is for the children of immigrants, it's actually true. Well, actually it's probably true for everybody, a little bit, but not nearly as much as teenagers think. But it's really true for the children of immigrants. It's a difficult thing to come of age in a world in which the people who are supposed to be your guides, your significant others, really came of age in a very different culture and a different society, and don't really understand the rules and the norms that, as Bernadette was saying, you know, where you actually know more and are translating for them the way things work. I mean, that can be difficult, okay? But incorporation, assimilation, for lack of a better word, is never an all or nothing experience. It's always a compromise. And in that compromise, some very creative things tend to happen. People who know very well that their parents' way doesn't really work, but aren't quite sure they want to abandon all of it, as you see with the Liberians, and are making accommodations and compromises, and maybe coming up with new and different ways of doing things. And when you get an age group in which such people constitute the majority, I think some very, very creative things happen. And my optimism about the second generation is really based on that. Now, having said that, let me just end in an impolitic way on a somewhat dark note, which is to say that for all of that optimism, there are a couple of things that I think that we have to be quite concerned about. By and large, the children of immigrants are doing as well in many ways as the children of natives in New York, but in this age group, that's not always so good. Right. Their problems don't come from having foreign-born parents. Very few of them, think that they have a distinct problem because they're outsiders in some sense. But being part of New York's working class today is often a real problem in terms of upward mobility. And they face very much the same problems that the children of natives do. And for folks who don't get a significant amount of education, that is really, often quite worrisome. A second is, of course, the question of what happens to the native minorities. And we started out this project in some ways worrying about would the children of immigrants end up joining native minority, particularly less successful native minority communities, and what some sociologists have called downwardly assimilating. If anything, the reverse is true, that the relative success of much of the children of the immigrant population is probably obscuring just how bad things have gotten in certain parts of the native minority population. And since we use terms like black, white, Hispanic, rather than actually look at people's origins, sometimes that statistically ends up getting merged. In many ways, I think the situation in certain parts of the African American community is a lot worse than we realize, and it's being masked partially by the fact that there's a substantial number of the children of black immigrants that are, if anything, raising the bar a little bit. Finally, there's the question of the undocumented. Now, you might ask, what does lack of documentation have to do with people who are born here? They're birthright citizens. There is a substantial population of people who are Americans for all practical intents and purposes, who came at very young ages, but still lack citizenship rights. The sociologist Roberto Gonzalez called this the phenomenon of waking up to a nightmare, discovering at the age of 16 or 17 that you're limited in terms of where you can work, that you're limited in terms of how you can go to school, because your parents didn't even tell you that you were not documented, assuming that they would figure out a way to get around that. And what's interesting is in the past, that was true. For a long time, people who were here, 10, 15, 20 years, usually figured out a way of regularizing their status. That became much, much more difficult in the 1990s. And the result is that we are now getting a large population of people. Rob Smith, one of the other contributors to the book, calls this the cruel natural experiment, in which people who were just a little bit older and qualified for the IRCA amnesty, or just a little bit younger and were born here, are having very different outcomes than the people who are stuck in that now increasingly permanent undocumented situation. It's also true that even U.S. citizens whose parents are undocumented tend to do worse educationally. Okay? And you can imagine why. Having parents who never could go to a PTA meeting, parents who were always felt politically outside of the community, who grew up in communities where there were a lot of such parents. Now, this is not as big a problem in New York as it is in some parts of the country, partially because we have a smaller undocumented population, and partially because our undocumented population is largely living in families of mixed status, and therefore they're not as isolated. Okay. But it's becoming a problem even here, and it's one that is really something that policy created, and that we need better policy and better immigration reform to straighten out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very, very interesting discussion. Thank you all panelists. We have time for like 2 questions. Anybody have a question or a comment in the audience? Raise your hand and I'll pick on you. Yes.
Outward migration.
Outward migration?
New immigrants coming to the city or coming to the area, and while the population's going up, always population in New York dissipates, goes outside New York City.
That's what I was asking too.
I think we're going to have to turn to our demographer.
I'm not sure. Sorry,
That's a good question. I just asked Nancy that. About out-migration, about immigrants moving out of the city.
well, each year more people more people leave the city than come in, but the city's population continues to increase because of natural increase. That's the excess of births over deaths. And one half of all kids born in New York City are born to immigrant mothers. So immigrants, increase the population not only directly by coming here, but through their fertility. So while we lose populations through out-migration, we more than make them up through immigration plus natural increase. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes.
I'm curious what differences seem to exist in the desire of these different groups to assimilate. My grandparents came over. The first thing they wanted to do, forget about all this, the old country, their old religion, etc. I assume there are big differences in the desire to learn English, to be integrated. Can you talk about that?
The question is, what is the desire to acculturate or assimilate among the different groups?
Well, I think, it's hard to lump all the different groups together, but just as in the past, people who come here as adults, right, as immigrants, come having lived a good part of their lives in their home country, right? They often speak a different language, as did immigrants 100 years ago. They inevitably maintain some of their traditional customs, although they also inevitably change in some ways the longer they live in New York. So really the key question about assimilation is not really, that's why I was going to turn to Phil, because the key question about assimilation is not really so much about immigrants who come here as adults, although of course they change and they adapt to life in New York, they get work, they take on new attitudes and values. We heard about Bernadette, about the parents, not just hanging on to their old traditions, but even learning new disciplinary practices in New York and what's expected. But the real change, if we're talking about assimilation, occurs among the children of immigrants and even the grandchildren of immigrants. And that's where we really say the main change. And that's why, I was looking over at Phil, because that's really that's where we're looking for it. And I think that's that's a fairly common pattern. And I think your question kind of gets into, this issue of immigrants in the past versus immigrants today. And, I think that, I think we find a lot of similarities. There obviously are differences. There are different groups. New York is a different place. But, in terms of assimilation, in terms of becoming American, in fact, that's quite similar. Now, one of the things I can speak, maybe I should turn to Phil, because in his book, right, or I can say it and then he can elaborate. One of the interesting things is that in the past, the children of immigrants, right, the Jewish, Italian children of immigrants often were ashamed of their parents, right? But as Phil and his colleagues show in their book, and as all of us who teach at CUNY must know, right, that the second generation today actually they're proud of their parents. They're proud of their parents' culture. They talk with great pride about, their parents' struggles to make it, and they're not embarrassed. I think that's a big change, actually. That's a change from the past, and that has to do with changes in this country.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that's really a change in American culture. In the sense, in fact, it's precisely because of the struggles of the earlier immigrants, plus the African-American-led civil rights movement, that kind of difference is far more legitimate today. So there's a lot less external pressure, I think, for people to, assimilate at all costs, although we can exaggerate that. I think there were always individual differences in this. There were always some people who very, very much wanted to learn English and fit into American society very quickly, and there were lots of people who didn't. And generally, I think because assimilation in the past happened, the historical memory tends to telescope it a little bit and exaggerate how fast it happened. It took a fairly long time for that big cohort of European immigrants who arrived before the 1920s to really feel totally at home in American society, and some people never did. But the question really is, okay, what did they pass on to their children? And even there, it's tricky because as in so many things in the social sciences, people say one thing and do another. And I don't think that assimilation, for most people, was ever a zero-sum game. And it certainly is not today. It's rarely, I've come here, I want to be American, I'm going to drop everything from the old country. Very often it's quite the opposite. It's, you had better continue to do it our old country way. Don't forget your past. Don't forget your language. Meanwhile, we're going to move you into a school that's outside the ethnic enclave because the schools are a little better, but make sure you don't forget. Meanwhile, we're going to actually, we're going to do this, and you can get a better job if your English is better, so maybe you can learn that. And very often, assimilation is something that occurs in spite of themselves, often in spite of parents' protestations that is exactly what they don't want. And I think that that's often what's happening today, and it's often what happened in the past as well.
Just make one, because
Yes.
I guess we have
Yes,
no more
Nancy,
questions.
go ahead.
So I think one of the good things that you raised was asking about the different groups. So let me put a plea, a little plug, right? We're 1 out of 3, because one of the things that the chapters on the groups do is they show some of the differences among the groups, because they're not all the same. Obviously, they face different issues, they come from different places, they bring different customs and cultures with them. They come and they face different problems when they come to New York. And so there'll be copies of the book for sale, is that true?
Yes.
Outside? So, right, I have to write. So I urge you to read it and to read more about the different groups and their experiences.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that
he's gonna-
in terms of health outcomes, you're better off actually if you don't assimilate. If you don't eat the junk food, and if you maintain your, the food habits of your parents. And also in terms of language, by the second generation, a majority actually have lost fluency in the native tongue of their parents. And by the third generation, everyone has. So, and those patterns are actually consistent across time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists. Please buy the book. Please buy the book. It's right out front. Thank you. And our panelists will be happy to sign for you.
You're also a lot less likely to get arrested.
I will email you. And the third generation.
Well, no, if you're like your parents.